My son walked into the lawyer's office with a smug smile, certain he was about to inherit every last dollar of his mother's empire. But when one single sentence was read aloud, everything he believed about power, blood, and loyalty collapsed in front of 24 silent witnesses. That is the moment my life turned into a story of betrayal, revenge, and recognition. I had never planned to be here. At 65, I thought my battles were behind me. I had made peace with my small apartment, my aging car, my quiet mornings with instant coffee. I thought the world had forgotten me, and I had convinced myself that forgetting was safer. But family betrayal has a way of dragging you back into the spotlight you thought you'd escaped. And in America, nothing reveals betrayal faster than an inheritance drama. The mahogany office smelled of old leather and polished wood. Diplomas lined the walls. Richard Collins, the attorney, adjusted his glasses with the calm detachment of a man who had read hundreds of wills. To him, this was just another case. To me, it was a storm that had been building for decades. Adrian Alvarez, my only son, sat across from me. 37 years old, handsome, tailored suit, the kind of watch that costs more than my entire car. He didn't look at me, not directly. He didn't need to. The smirk on his face told the whole story. To Adrian, I was already buried, irrelevant, forgotten, a man erased from the narrative of his brilliant mother, Clara Nguyen. He leaned back in his chair, perfectly confident. Everyone in the room expected the same outcome, that Clara's millions, her company, her empire would naturally pass to the son she had groomed for success. Adrian believed it was already his. He thought this meeting was a formality, a stage where his victory would be announced. He even rehearsed the triumphant smile he planned to give me when the numbers were read. But here's the truth about shocking twists. They arrive when you least expect them. Richard cleared his throat. The room stilled and a hush fell so heavy I could hear my own pulse. Then he began to read. To my beloved son, Adrian Alvarez. Adrian straightened, his smirk widening. He waited for the flood of wealth to wash over him. I leave the house on Hillcrest Avenue along with $500,000 contingent on continued employment with the company. For a split second, I saw it, the flicker in his eyes, the confusion breaking through arrogance. His smile faltered. The empire was not his, not yet. And that one sentence, that single condition, was the crack that would shatter everything. What came next would ignite a revenge story, a battle between father versus son, a story of betrayal and redemption, written not in silence, but in fire. The phone rang that Thursday afternoon, its shrill tones slicing through the ordinary quiet of my kitchen. I was on my knees mopping up spilled coffee, cursing the cheap paper filter that had torn again, when the sound drilled into my ears. Outside, Margaret Lewis was shouting through the thin fence about my sprinklers flooding her begonias. It was all so routine, so predictable, so small. But then I picked up the receiver, and the voice on the other end carved open a wound I thought had scarred over. Mr. Alvarez, this is Janet Morrison from Riverside Memorial Chapel. I regret to inform you that Mrs. Clara Nguyen passed away on Tuesday evening. The world went silent. For a moment I thought I had misheard, that the static had twisted her words. Clara Nguyen, my former wife, my son's mother. The woman who had once promised me forever, then spent 2 decades proving forever, was a lie. My hand tightened on the phone until my knuckles ached. I sat down hard in the chair by the sink, the wood creaking under me, as if it too was not prepared for this news. It had been 15 years since I last saw Clara face to face. 15 years since the divorce papers turned our life into a business transaction, since Adrian chose her world of power and polished ambition over my world of small paychecks and worn-out values. 15 years of family betrayal. Not the kind you read about in tabloids, but the quiet, suffocating kind that poisons every memory. And now she was gone. Just like that. I tried to speak, to ask how, to ask why, but my voice sounded foreign, distant. The woman on the phone filled the silence with details. Funeral Friday, 2 o'clock. Riverside Memorial, followed by the reading of the will. My name was listed as a beneficiary. A beneficiary. The word struck like a blow. Why would Clara include me in anything after all these years? What did it mean? I mumbled that I would attend, though my throat burned with disbelief. When I hung up, the kitchen looked unchanged, the coffee stains still spreading on the linoleum, the sunlight still catching the dust in the air. But everything inside me was shifting, breaking loose. Memories came flooding back, not gentle recollections, but storms of betrayal. I remembered Clara in 1987, standing in a diner in a red wool coat, arguing with a manager who refused to hire women for weekend shifts. I remembered the spark in her eyes, the certainty in her voice. She was fire, and I was moth. I fell hard, believing I had found someone extraordinary. And for a time, she was. We married, we built a life, we brought Adrian into the world. For those first years, I thought love was enough, but love was never enough for Clara. As her consulting firm grew, so did the distance. Business dinners replaced family dinners. Client emergencies replaced birthdays. Vacations turned into conferences. She built an empire brick by brick while I kept the lights on at the power plant and tried to remind our son that fishing trips and homemade birthday cakes still mattered. But ambition is seductive. Clara thrived on applause, on headlines, on being the woman who made it. And Adrian, impressionable and eager, drank it all in. I can still hear his voice at 17, sharp and cold. Dad, you settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake. That sentence cut deeper than any insult I had ever heard. It wasn't just Clara who had left me. It was my son molded into her mirror image, dismissing me as a failure. That is what betrayal feels like, not just being abandoned, but watching the people you love choose the very world that despises you. Now, hearing Clara was gone, I felt not relief, not closure, but a tidal wave of unfinished anger. She had taken 22 years of my life, then walked away as if I were an obstacle, a liability. She had turned Adrian against me. She had painted me as a man who clipped her wings, when in truth I had only wanted us to fly together. And the cruelest part was that the world believed her version. The phone call replayed in my mind on a loop beneficiary funeral will. Why would Clara remember me at all? What game was she still playing from beyond the grave? Betrayal does not die with the betrayer, it lingers. It haunts it, rewrites every memory. And now with one sentence, Clara had reached out from the grave to pull me back into her empire of control. As I sat in that silent kitchen, I felt the sting of old wounds ripping open. I thought of Adrian waiting in his suit, certain that his mother's empire would soon be his. I thought of the smirk he would wear when the inheritance was read. And I thought of myself, the forgotten man dragged back into an inheritance drama I had never asked for. Betrayal has a taste. It is bitter metallic like blood in your mouth after a fight. That night, as I pressed my only good suit, I knew I was walking back into a storm that had begun decades ago. A storm named Clara Nguyen. And though she was gone, her shadow was about to consume us all. The chapel stood like a fortress on the hill stone walls, glowing in the pale Wyoming sun. From a distance, it looked like a place of peace. But as I pulled my 15-year-old Honda into the circular drive surrounded by polished Cadillacs, BMWs, and Teslas, I felt like a trespasser. The air smelled of lilies and polished mahogany, the trappings of wealth, the mask of grief. Inside the funeral was draped in elegance rows of white flowers, stained glass shimmering the organ, whispering solemn notes. But I knew even before I took my seat that this wasn't going to be a gathering of sorrow. It would be a stage for judgment, for whispers, for the rewriting of history. This wasn't just a farewell. It was another trial. I slipped into the back pew, my black suit too loose at the shoulders, the fabric shiny from years of wear. The crowd was already buzzing their murmurs, rising and falling like the tide. I recognized faces from the business dinners. Clara once dragged me to men with gold watches and women in black dresses that whispered wealth with every stitch. They spoke in hushed voices, but their eyes found me anyway. Her ex-husband. Can you believe he showed up? I could feel the judgment pressing on my back like a physical weight. The coffin rested at the front, draped in silk, framed by flowers that must have cost more than my annual salary. Clara's portrait gazed out above it, confident, poised, still glowing with that fire that had once drawn me in. But here in this hall, her memory had been polished into perfection, all ambition and triumph, none of the cracks, none of the cost. The Clara they praised was a visionary, a builder, a woman who conquered the odds. The Clara I remembered was also the woman who had torn our family apart in her pursuit of greatness. And then slicing through the murmurs, a voice rang out, sharp, commanding, impossible to ignore. Dad. The word cracked across the room like a whip. Heads turned, conversations stopped. I looked up and there was Adrian striding down the aisle in a tailored black suit, every inch the heir to his mother's empire. At 37, he carried her face, her posture, her authority. But the eyes, those belonged to him, cold and burning with contempt. He stopped beside me, his jaw tight, his voice pitched just loud enough for every person in the chapel to hear. "What are you doing here?" For a moment I couldn't breathe. Every eye was on us, the air thick with expectation. I came to pay my respects. Adrian leaned closer, the scent of expensive cologne filling my nose, his words cutting through the silence. "You lost that right 15 years ago." His tone dripped with venom, and I felt the murmurs ripple through the crowd again. The narrative had already been written, and in their story, I was the villain who had held back a brilliant woman. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said quietly. "I'll sit in the back. I won't speak to anyone." But Adrian wasn't finished. He straightened, turning to face the mourners as if he were the officiant, as if the service were his stage. For those who don't know, he announced, his voice carrying with the confidence of a man used to commanding rooms. "This is Martin Alvarez, the man who spent 22 years holding my mother back while she built an empire." A murmur of approval rose like a jury nodding along with the prosecutor. I felt my face burn. He continued, relentless. "While my mother was creating opportunities for hundreds, he was content to punch a clock and complain about her ambitions. He took half her assets in the divorce despite contributing nothing, and then he spent the next 15 years playing the victim." Each word was another blade twisting deeper, not because it was entirely false, but because it erased the complexity, the love, the sacrifices. In his story, I was not a man who tried, who struggled, who loved. I was just a failure. The chapel was silent except for his voice rising with conviction. She deserved a partner who lifted her higher, not one who dragged her down. "Don't let his presence today fool you. He doesn't belong here." I stood, my legs shaking, but my voice steady. "Are you finished?" I asked. The question surprised him. He had expected me to crumble. The crowd held its breath, waiting for my collapse. Instead, I looked him in the eye and said, "I loved your mother for 40 years, 22 of them as her husband, and 18 more as someone who still wished her well. I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here because, once upon a time, we made promises that mattered, and I choose to honor them." The silence was heavy, suffocating. Adrian's face tightened, but he had no words ready. The funeral director stepped forward hastily, announcing the service would begin in 5 minutes, eager to regain control of the stage. But I knew as I sat back down that the damage was done. The funeral was no longer about Clara's memory. It had become a battlefield, a spectacle of father versus son, another chapter in a revenge story that wasn't finished. When I closed my eyes that night after the funeral, the chapel faded and the years fell away, like pages torn from a book. Suddenly I was 29 again, standing in Murphy's Diner on a February evening, the snow outside piling against the windows. That's when I first saw Clara. She wore a red wool coat that made her look like a flame against the dim yellow lights, and she was arguing with the manager, her voice sharp and fearless. He had said women couldn't handle the pressure of managing weekend shifts, and Clara, with her jaw set and her eyes blazing, tore his reasoning to pieces. She was magnificent in her anger, and I was hooked before I even knew her name. I can still remember the way my fork froze halfway to my mouth, apple pie untouched, because I couldn't take my eyes off her. When she stormed out, leaving a business card on the counter, I followed her into the cold just long enough to see her climb into a blue Honda Civic, checking her mirrors twice before pulling into the street. That was Clara, fiery but careful, bold but methodical. I memorized the number on that card, and 3 days later, I dialed it with shaking hands. She answered on the second ring, brisk and confident, Clara Nguyen. And somehow, against all odds, that conversation turned into dinner, then another, then a life. Our wedding day glowed with September sunshine. She wore her grandmother's dress altered to fit her slender frame, and she whispered forever when I slid the ring onto her finger. And for a while, forever felt real. I believed in it when we moved into our first tiny apartment, when we painted the walls ourselves, when we sat on the floor eating takeout and laughing about leaky faucets. I believed in it most of all when Adrian was born 2 years later, his tiny fist waving his cry, filling the hospital room like a promise. I watched Clara cradle him with the same fierce determination she had used to face down that diner manager, and I thought, this is it. This is everything I'll ever need. But forever has a way of cracking when ambition starts pressing against its edges. Clara was never content with enough. What began as a small consulting gig in our spare room grew into contracts, clients, an office, and eventually an empire. I worked at the power plant, steady and invisible, making sure the lights stayed on. Clara worked the world-dazzling people with her brilliance, bringing home checks that dwarfed my entire salary. At first, I was proud. Who wouldn't be? But pride turned into distance, and distance turned into silence. Adrian grew up in that silence. He had Clara's sharp features and her sharper mind. When he was 7, she bought him a computer that cost more than my monthly paycheck. "He needs to think digitally," she said, and I could only watch as my boy typed commands I didn't understand. When I suggested taking him fishing, she laughed, not kindly, but with that edge that said my world was outdated, irrelevant. The house changed too. We left behind the little kitchen table where Adrian colored his homework, while Clara and I talked about our day. We moved into a house with a chandelier and a table that seated 12. Clara called it progress. To me, it felt like exile inside my own life. The table shone like a mirror, every fingerprint, a flaw, every meal, another business negotiation. Guests came and went, clients and investors, people who looked at me as though I was furniture. And every time Clara introduced me with an apologetic smile, "This is Martin. He works at the power plant." Not pride, not respect, just excuse. Adrian thrived in that world. At 10, he was debating software with Clara's colleagues. At 14, he was rolling his eyes when I suggested a camping trip. By 17, he had learned to wield words sharper than knives. "Dad, you settled for mediocrity. I won't make that mistake." Those words cut deeper than I can ever describe. It wasn't just Clara who had outgrown me. It was my son. The years after blurred into one long descent. Clara's empire grew. Our marriage crumbled. Adrian looked at me with contempt I didn't know how to fight. I begged Clara to slow down, to remember birthdays, baseball games, nights at home. She told me the business came first, that someone had to make hard choices. The hardest choice, it turned out, was letting go. When she finally said, "Maybe it's time we stop pretending this is working," I knew forever had ended. The divorce was clean on paper, devastating in life. Clara got almost everything. Adrian got her loyalty. I got silence. For 15 years, that silence echoed through every room I lived in, every meal I ate alone. And now with her death, all those memories came flooding back. Love and betrayal, joy and abandonment, promises and lies. I realized that my life was not just shaped by Clara's ambition, but scarred by it. And Adrian was the proof, standing against me, carrying her world in his eyes. After the funeral ended, I thought I could finally slip away, fade into the background, as I had done for most of Clara's life after the divorce. I reached for my jacket, ready to vanish into the anonymity of my 15-year-old Honda, when a calm, measured voice stopped me. "Mr. Alvarez," it said, steady and firm, the kind of voice that carries weight even in a room heavy with grief. I turned to see Richard Collins approaching. Impeccably dressed, briefcase in hand, he looked like the kind of man who thrived on secrets, and at that moment he held mine. He offered his hand with practiced politeness. "I'd like a word with you and your son," he said. His eyes flicked toward Adrian, who was still surrounded by mourners offering him sympathy. Adrian broke away reluctantly, irritation already tightening his jaw as he joined us. Richard's expression never wavered, his tone calm but firm. "There are matters regarding Mrs. Nguyen's estate that require both of you to be present." Adrian bristled immediately. "Both of us? That's not necessary. He's not..." He gestured at me as though I were a stain on the wall. But Richard cut him off. "Your mother was very specific. She named both of you. By law and by her direct instruction, you must both be present for the reading." His voice carried no room for negotiation. In that moment, I felt a strange chill, as though Clara herself had reached out from the grave and placed her hand on my shoulder. It wasn't chance. It wasn't oversight. Clara had planned this, orchestrated it with the precision she brought to every contract and every deal. She had wanted me there. The question was why the walk to Richard's office was only a few blocks through downtown Rock Springs, but every step felt heavier than the last. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, their windows reflecting the gray sky. Adrian strode ahead, his polished shoes striking the pavement like drum beats of impatience. I followed in silence, each block echoing with memories I couldn't shake. Clara had built her empire on planning, on outmaneuvering, on never leaving anything to chance. If she had demanded my presence, it meant something more than sentiment. It meant strategy. Richard's office was housed in a restored Victorian building, all dark wood and tall windows. Inside, the walls were lined with leather-bound books and certificates, photos of Richard with local dignitaries. Everything about the place radiated respectability and permanence. Adrian dropped into the chair nearest the desk, radiating entitlement, while I took the seat slightly to the side, fitting my role as the outsider. Richard settled behind his desk, carefully opening a thick folder. Before he began, he looked at both of us with the solemnity of a judge. "I want you both to understand something," he said. "Your mother prepared these documents with meticulous care. She reviewed every word, made sure every provision would stand against challenge. She insisted that both of you be here today together. Nothing about this is accidental." Adrian shifted in his seat, clearly annoyed, but unable to mask the faint flicker of unease in his eyes. I felt it too, a tightening in my chest. Clara had always been 10 steps ahead, even when it destroyed our marriage. Now she was still ahead even in death. Richard continued, his voice steady, almost ritualistic. "What you are about to hear represents Mrs. Nguyen's final wishes. They are binding, they are clear, and they were made without coercion. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she left no ambiguity." As he spoke, I realized that this was more than a reading of numbers. It was Clara's last performance, her final move in a game that had consumed her life. She had arranged the pieces so that Adrian and I would be forced into the same room, forced to hear the same words, forced to confront the truth she had left behind. It was not about money, it was about control. It was about her shaping the future even after she was gone. I looked at Adrian, his jaw tight, his hands clenched on the armrests. He believed this was his coronation, the final confirmation that he was his mother's chosen heir. But Richard's measured tone told me otherwise. Something waited in those pages that would shatter his certainty. That's when I realized this wasn't just an inheritance drama. This was a design. Clara had built a trap with her mother's will, and both of us were caught inside it. Richard Collins adjusted his glasses, the weight of the file heavy in his hands. The room was quiet except for the faint tick of the antique clock on his bookshelf. Adrian leaned forward with a smile that carried all the arrogance of certainty, the heir about to claim his throne. I sat rigid, a spectator to a play I never auditioned for. Richard's voice cut through the silence. "To my beloved son, Adrian Alvarez." Adrian straightened instantly, his smirk widening the room, tilting toward him. Everyone expected the floodgates of wealth to open now the empire handed down like a crown. "I leave the family home on Hillcrest Avenue along with a sum of $500,000 contingent on his continued employment with Alvarez Consulting for a minimum of 2 years. The words hung in the air like smoke. For the briefest moment, I saw Adrian's eyes flicker, the smile falter, confusion breaking through confidence. $500,000 in a house, nothing compared to the empire Clara had built, and conditions attached. The murmurs in the room shifted like wind, curiosity stirring. Adrian forced a smile, pretending this was what he expected, but his fingers tapped against the armrest, restless. Richard didn't pause. His voice rolled forward, relentless. "The remainder of Mrs. Nguyen's estate, including her investment portfolio, subsidiary holdings, and controlling interest in Alvarez Consulting, is bequeathed to..." He stopped just long enough for the world to tilt. His eyes met mine. "To my former husband, Martin Alvarez." My breath caught. My chest clenched as though the air had been ripped away. $33.5 million. 65% ownership of the company. Chairman of the board. Words that didn't belong to me, numbers so large they might as well have been carved in another language. The room tilted sideways, reality bending. Adrian was on his feet before the chair hit the wall. "What did you just say?" His voice cracked, a mixture of rage and disbelief. Richard repeated it calmly, without apology. Adrian's face drained of color, then flushed red, his blood unable to decide where to go. He turned on me, eyes blazing. "You did this. You manipulated her. You poisoned her mind when she was sick." His accusations lashed across the room like whips, each word more desperate than the last. I shook my head weakly. "I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. But Adrian wasn't listening. He slammed his palm on the desk, scattering papers. "Nobody gives away everything to an ex-husband unless they were coerced." This is fraud. His voice rose raw and unhinged, but Richard remained steady. Your mother anticipated such challenges. She underwent extensive mental competency evaluations before finalizing this will. She was of sound mind and clear purpose. The storm in Adrian's eyes deepened, but before he could explode again, Richard lifted another envelope, his tone changing. Your mother also left a personal message addressed to both of you. She asked that I read it after her will. The room stilled the air thick. Richard unfolded the cream-colored pages, Clara's handwriting etched across them. He began. My dearest Martin, if you are hearing this, I am gone. I can imagine your face confused, reluctant to believe, convinced this must be a mistake. But it is not a mistake. You deserve every penny, every responsibility I'm leaving you, and I need Adrian to hear why. Her words were a knife and a balm at once. Martin, I never stopped loving you. Not during our fights, not during the divorce, not during our years apart. I chose ambition over family, and I live with that regret. You begged me to remember what mattered, but I was too proud to listen. You carried integrity, character, the strength I lost sight of. This inheritance is my way of acknowledging that truth. I felt tears sting hot and sudden. Richard continued. Adrian, my brilliant boy, I know you are furious, but you are not ready for this empire. You lived under the shadow of my success, but you never learned what it means to build from nothing. You need freedom from the weight of wealth to discover who you truly are. That is why I left you enough to live comfortably, but not the empire. This is not punishment, it is a gift. Adrian's face twisted, torn between rage and devastation. His lips trembled as though he wanted to argue, but his mother's voice from beyond the grave silenced him. Richard read the final lines. Martin used this fortune wisely. Do what I could not use wealth as a tool for good, not as proof of superiority. Adrian, forgive your father, for his only crime was being human. Remember that true success is not measured in numbers, but in love and integrity. That is my final wish. When Richard folded the letter, the silence was absolute. My hands shook as I clutched the words that felt heavier than gold. Adrian collapsed into his chair, staring at the floor, the empire gone, the truth unshakable. And me, I sat frozen, knowing that everything had just changed, not because of wealth, but because Clara had finally chosen character over ambition. For a long moment after Richard folded Clara's letter, there was nothing but silence. My hands still trembled, the words of her confession and her absolution burning against my skin, as though the pages themselves carried heat. Across from me, Adrian sat rigid, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor as if looking too closely at me would set him on fire. Then the silence cracked. This isn't over, he said, his voice low but sharp, the promise of war hiding in each syllable. He straightened suddenly, slamming his palms on Richard's desk. I'll contest this. Fraud, undue influence, mental incapacity, you name it. I'll find the loophole. There's no way my mother gave everything to a man who abandoned her. I won't let him steal what's rightfully mine. His words came out in bursts like gunfire, and for a moment I saw not the polished man in the suit, but the boy still desperate for approval, still angry that he had never been enough without his mother's validation. Richard's tone was unyielding. Adrian, your mother anticipated this. She included a no contest clause. Any challenge to the will means you forfeit even the property and funds already allocated to you. You risk losing everything. The color drained from Adrian's face, his jaw working furiously as he tried to find another weapon, another angle. He turned to me instead, eyes blazing. This is your fault. You manipulated her memory, twisted her regret into some kind of sick revenge. You don't deserve this. You never did. His words cut deep, not because I believed them, but because part of me still carried the guilt of our marriage's collapse, still carried the shame of not being enough for Clara. But Clara's letter echoed louder. She had admitted her own failures, her own pride, her own inability to choose love over ambition. For the first time in decades, I felt seen, and yet there was no victory in that, only weight. I tried to meet his fury with calm. Adrian, I didn't ask for this. I never wanted the company, the money, any of it. But your mother believed I should have it. Not for me, but for what I might do with it. This isn't a prize. It's a responsibility. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Responsibility. You worked at a power plant your whole life. You don't know the first thing about running a multi-million-dollar corporation. You'll burn it to the ground." His contempt washed over me, but underneath I felt something else: fear. Not fear of failure, but fear of proving him right. Adrian's words weren't entirely wrong. I didn't know how to run a company. I had no boardroom experience, no taste for corporate battles. All I had was Clara's faith written in ink I still couldn't fully believe. Richard leaned forward, his tone softer now, but still firm. "Your mother prepared for that as well. The management team is competent. They will guide you through the transition. But make no mistake, her decision was final. The company, the fortune, the responsibility, they are yours, Martin." I nodded slowly, the truth sinking in like cold water. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like chains being placed on my shoulders. Clara hadn't handed me a crown. She had handed me the burden she had carried until it consumed her. And now it was mine to bear. Adrian's voice snapped me back. "You think this makes you a better man? That somehow her last words erase everything? You ruined her life. You ruined mine. And now you want to play savior?" I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to tell him he didn't know the whole story. But looking at him trembling with rage and grief, I saw the boy who had spent his life in his mother's shadow, who had learned to measure love in contracts and success in profits. He wasn't just angry, he was broken. And I was part of the reason. "No," I said quietly. "I don't think this makes me a hero. It makes me responsible. That's all." The room fell into silence again. Richard began gathering the papers, his movements careful, restoring order after chaos. Adrian sank back into his chair, his fury simmering but cornered by the truth of the law. I held Clara's letter against my chest, its weight heavier than gold. There was no victory here, only duty, only the recognition that love had been buried beneath ambition, and that I was the one left holding the legacy of that choice. This wasn't a win, it was a burden, and it was mine now. Adrian sat across from me, his body tense, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles looked white. His chest rose and fell with the ragged rhythm of someone trying not to drown. The rage in his eyes was still there, but beneath it I caught something else, something raw, almost fragile. For the first time I saw not the man in the expensive suit, but the boy I had once carried on my shoulders, the boy who used to look at me with trust instead of contempt. And in that silence I found words I hadn't planned. "She didn't do this to you, Adrian," I said quietly, my voice steady. "She did it for you." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than Clara's will, heavier than the fortune now resting in my hands. Adrian froze, his lips parting as if to spit back another insult, but nothing came. He stared at me, his anger colliding with confusion. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable, but it was different this time. It wasn't the silence of judgment or of shame. It was the silence of truth pressing down, forcing its way into a heart that didn't want to hear it. Richard watched us carefully, his hands folded on the desk, saying nothing. He knew this moment wasn't his to mediate. It was mine. It was Adrian's. And it was Clara's, still pulling strings even from beyond the grave. Adrian shook his head slowly, his voice breaking. "For me, you called this for me. She stripped me of everything. She left me with scraps while you of all people get the empire." His words wavered, caught between fury and despair. I leaned forward, my hands trembling, but my voice steady. "She gave me the empire because I didn't want it, because I won't use it to prove myself or to crush others. But you, Adrian, you've spent your life chasing her shadow, fighting to be enough. She knew giving you all this would only chain you tighter to her mistakes. She gave me the burden so you could finally be free." For the first time, Adrian's eyes flickered with doubt. His jaw tightened. His throat worked as though he was swallowing something too large. He wanted to reject it, to throw my words back in my face, but I could see the conflict in him. Deep down, he knew Clara was capable of such a choice. Deep down, he knew her love for him wasn't measured in numbers on a balance sheet. "She did it for you," I repeated, softer this time, the way I might have spoken to him when he was a child afraid of the dark. "So you could finally find out who you are without her empire defining you. So you could build something of your own." The silence that followed was unbearable. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands clammy against the arms of my chair. Adrian's eyes darted away, then back to mine, then down to the floor. He pressed his palms against his thighs, shaking his head again, but slower now, less certain. His lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he exhaled long and shaky as though he was releasing years of tension he hadn't even realized he carried. His expression softened for just a second, and I saw the boy he used to be, the boy who once laughed at my terrible fishing jokes, who begged me to lift him higher on my shoulders so he could see fireworks over the county fair. Then just as quickly the mask returned. His jaw clenched, his eyes hardened. His voice turned sharp again. "I don't need your pity or her excuses." He stood abruptly, grabbing his coat, but his movements lacked the certainty they had before. There was hesitation in the way his hands shook, in the way he avoided my eyes. As he walked toward the door, I called after him, not loudly but firmly enough for him to hear. "Whether you believe me or not, Adrian, she did it for you." He stopped in the doorway, his back to me, his shoulders tense. For a moment I thought he might turn, that he might let the weight of those words break through the armor he had built his entire life. But he didn't. He left without a word, the door closing softly behind him. Yet in that quiet, in that almost turn, I knew something had shifted. The seed was planted. Maybe he would curse me for it tomorrow. Maybe he would deny it for years, but one day he would understand. Clara hadn't abandoned him. She had given him a chance, and all I had done was remind him of it. When I finally stepped out of Richard's office, the late afternoon sun spilled across the street like molten gold. For hours I had sat in a room where my past had been torn open, my son's rage laid bare, and Clara's final words burned into my soul. But out here in the cool Wyoming air, I could breathe again. I held the letter tightly in my hand, its pages already creased from my grip. It wasn't the fortune that mattered, or the company, or the numbers. It was this Clara's voice reaching across time to remind me of who I was and who I still could be. The world had always told me I was a failure, that I was the man who settled the man who held her back. But as I stood there feeling the sun warm my face, I understood what Clara had seen at the end. I had not been her rival. I had been her anchor. And in the silence that followed her passing, she had chosen to honor that truth. I thought of Adrian storming out with fury in his eyes and doubt in his heart. Maybe he hated me now more than ever. But maybe he heard what I said. Maybe one day he would understand. Clara had not done this to punish him. She had done it to set him free. I looked at the letter one last time before slipping it carefully inside my jacket. And then I whispered it, not just for myself, not just for Clara, but for anyone who had ever felt erased, betrayed, or forgotten. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about recognition. That is the truth that outlives ambition, outlives betrayal, outlives death itself. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever lived through a betrayal that made you question your own worth? Have you ever waited years for recognition only to realize it came in an unexpected way? Share your story in the comments. I'll be reading them. Don't forget to save this video if it spoke to you, and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter in this journey of family betrayal, inheritance drama, and shocking twists. Because the stories don't end here. They never do.